So in this video, I wanted to have a chat with you about one of the things I think is most difficult thing to master as a manager, but actually if you can do this, it's actually kind of a real game changer. And that's about having difficult conversations at work. And so this video is really from the perspective of a manager having to have difficult conversations with one of their team members. But if you like it, or make a comment below if you're interested in having the same video the other way around, so how you can enter into difficult conversations as a team member, then that's something we can do in the future. But yeah, as I say, this video is more from the perspective of a manager, the things that you can do to have constructive conversations around difficult topics at work. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the things as a manager that you can do to make sure you have a constructive conversation when it's on a difficult topic, because I think it's one of the biggest challenges that I certainly have faced, and hopefully it will help you just enter into those conversations in a more productive way. So the first thing to establish is why you think a conversation is going to be difficult. And it might be for a number of factors, but if you can understand why you think it might be difficult, then that's going to help you to understand the best approach or tools and techniques kind of want to in that conversation. So most of us know when we're about to have a difficult conversation. We usually get some warning, particularly if it's us having to have that conversation with a team member. It might be about performance or different elements. So I'm going to talk about some of the things you can do to prepare for why you think this might be difficult. So the first reason that you think it might be difficult is that you're not sure what the right thing to say is. And these are usually kind of the sensitive, personal conversations that you need to have with someone, but you're not quite sure what the right language might be or the right messaging that you need to give. So think about what's exactly is tricky about this conversation, and then if you need to, talk it through with a colleague or a more senior person, or perhaps get some advice from HR. So if it's about a very personal issue, like perhaps presentation or how they're turning up physically to work, you might just want to get the sensitivities of that and understand from HR kind of what your party line is and what the policy is that you need to refer to. Another reason you think it might be difficult is you're worried that person's going to have a very strong reaction. So maybe there's someone who's prone to losing their temper, or someone who might fly off the handle, and you're kind of worried about perhaps the anger or kind of the approach that they're going to take. Or indeed if there's someone who shuts down a lot or perhaps won't engage properly in the conversation. So thinking about if you're worried about that conversation because of the reaction you're going to have, think about some of the tools or interventions that you can have to set that up. So it might be giving them some more information ahead of time. It might be allowing them to bring someone with them. It might be having a short, sharp meeting where you talk about what you need to, and then having a follow-up meeting, but just thinking about managing their communication styles or managing their reactions so that it doesn't kind of disintegrate into a unproductive meeting and you can get your point across. Another reason why it might be tricky is that you know it's on a topic where you have differing opinions. So if you know that you and your team member come at it from quite different angles, understanding their point of view and perhaps where they need some evidence. So quite often people need examples to understand why something's been inappropriate or why it's falling short of the mark. But if you know you're going to have a difference of opinion between where you perhaps think their performance is and where they do, going in with some evidence or going in with something that's going to be able to show them what you're talking about might be helpful. So if you're thinking about you're coming at it from different perspectives, then make sure you've got the information that you need to kind of effectively communicate with them. And finally, one of the reasons as a manager we often think conversations are going to be difficult is perhaps there's going to be an unpleasant outcome. So it may be that you're going to have to terminate someone or take them off the training contract. It may be that you've got to relay a negative message from more seniors within the business. So for instance, there may be a pay freeze or a pay cut, or there may not be bonuses this year. So often we go into conversations because we're concerned about basically the information we've got to convey and what the outcome is for the individual. And let's be honest, having to get rid of someone or having to terminate someone is difficult, even if you've been through a long performance management process with them, or even if it's for a factor outside of your control, like cuts. So that might be another reason why you think the conversation is going to be unpleasant, and just kind of bracing yourself for that. Actually, no one likes to receive really bad news. And so making sure that you're going to do that in an empathetic way and in a way that's kind of gentle is a way to think about having that type of difficult conversation. And it's important to understand why you need to tackle poor performance or behaviour, because sometimes it can feel like that's more hassle than it's worth. But actually what will end up happening is that will start permeating throughout the rest of your team. And the standards you set are the standards you get. So if you allow people to get away with poor performance or behaviours, then ultimately that's going to demotivate the rest of your team and perhaps set high performing individuals at odds with these individuals. So although it's not a pleasant conversation to have, you have to focus on the wider good that you will need to do. And sometimes by having performance management conversations actually enables people to see what they need to do to improve or to understand that they're falling short of the expected standard. And that might seem obvious to you as their manager, but actually for them, they may not have that insight. So by understanding like their own, how they kind of sit within the team or how their performance is kind of impacting others, allows them to get some understanding and identify what they need to do to improve to make that better. You may be having a meeting which is about dealing with a complaint or grievance, either from another team member or perhaps a client. And they are tricky because you don't want to get into a he said, she said kind of argument. So making sure that you're sticking to the facts and also following any process that you have within the organisation that you work, just to make sure that you're following the correct process for dealing with those things by kind of the letter of like your HR law or whatever. But understanding that if a complaint or grievance has been put in against an individual, it is your responsibility as a manager to explore that fully with them, get their perspective, but also not be too kind of presupposing before you go into that meeting about what may have gone on or what kind of the complaint or grievance is. So making sure you're going into those types of difficult conversations with a slightly open mind, and understanding what you need to establish from them about the situation or what happened. We've touched a little bit about conflict within the team, but perhaps you're going to have a difficult conversation to try and head off ongoing tension or conflicts that might be within teams. Now, of course, with any group of humans, we're going to get some personality clashes or some people who naturally don't gel as well. So what you're trying to achieve from those conversations is to get a consensus about how you're going to move forward, and an understanding of what people can do individually to either moderate their behaviour or to change their interactions with certain people. And reducing that conflict should be the outcome that you're trying to have from that difficult conversation. So try not to focus too much on the actual conversation itself, but more about what's the positive outcome you're trying to achieve for the team. And ultimately, no one likes to come to a workplace where they feel that there's conflict or tension. So every team member is going to thank you for having had that difficult conversation as and when. And finally, we talked a little bit earlier about communicating tough business decisions. So understanding that you as a manager will need to get the firm's position across or your company's position across, but then also you need to be able to listen to the employee and listen to their concerns or their perceptions around things, such as redundancies or reduction of kind of financial benefits. You need to be able to listen and recognise and identify some things that you might be able to do to mitigate that, or to kind of make sure that they remain engaged within the team and that they take away the positives as well as whatever that tough business decision is. So we've talked a little bit about like why we might be having to have difficult conversations and kind of what the benefits are. So the next is how you do that. So firstly, set it up right. No one likes to be completely poleaxed by some bad news or a difficult conversation. So making sure that you've opened up those lines of communication and you kind of set up the meeting as appropriately as you can. So the first thing you need to think about is recognise when is the right time to have that conversation. And there may be situations where you need to do that very quickly. So perhaps there's been an incident that's happened within a meeting or something you need to kind of adjust very quickly, or something perhaps that's been brewing over a period of time and you need to work out when's the right time to have that conversation. And that's thinking about not only in terms of the immediacy of what's happened, but also in terms of what time of day is most appropriate, when is, have they got a day when it's very pressured and they're perhaps not going to give that conversation the right time. So thinking about when within your working week is the best time to have that conversation so that you are minimising outputs. Calling someone in first thing on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon isn't always the most positive thing to do, because it either kind of they haven't really had time to prepare for it on the Monday morning, or it kind of will bleed over into the weekend on a Friday. But just thinking about when's the right time for you to have that conversation. Once you've worked out when the right time is, make sure you've given enough time for that conversation. You might think it's only going to be a quick 10 minutes, but it's probably going to take longer, and they need to feel that they are not pressured within that conversation to react very quickly, and they need time to be able to work it through with you and discuss at length, if they need to, some of the key elements. So make sure you've blocked out enough time in yours and theirs diary to be able to do that. The next is to set up the logistics of how you're going to have that. So think about location. Are you going to do it in person? Are you going to do it in Teams? Are you going to do it in the office? Are you going to do it in a neutral location? Are you going to take them out for a coffee? Is it more informal? Or do you need the formality of a kind of meeting room and those types of things? So thinking about the logistics of it, and then how you communicate it to them. So don't just pop an invite in their diary, because it will start to worry people, but send them an email first just saying, I need to put a meeting in your diary to discuss X, Y, and Z. This is what I'd like you to prep in advance. This is kind of roughly what we're going to talk about. And so it just gives them a bit of a heads up rather than being blindsided that, we need to have a conversation about it and this is what we're going to be covering. And the other thing to do is think about it from their perspective, not just yours. So, you're going to be a little bit tense or a little bit worked up perhaps because it's going to be a difficult conversation, but it is going to be for them as well. So make sure that as a manager, you've got that empathy and that you are thinking about it from their perspective and what's going to work for them as well in terms of those logistics and the communications that you're sending to them ahead of the meeting. The next thing is to think about the prep that you need to do as a manager to have that as effective a conversation as you can. And obviously there's lots of different scenarios we've talked about and lots of different types of information that you might need. So the first thing to do is think about what information do I need before I go into that meeting. So thinking about what you're trying to achieve. So is it you need an action plan for them to improve? Is it that you just need to convey some information? Is it that you need to get their perspective or input into something in terms of a grievance or a complaint? So thinking about the different types of information you need from them as part of that meeting, and then start to write down some questions that you want to ask in the way that's going to open up a good dialogue. So don't use closed questions, yes or no, trying to structure those questions in a way that you're going to encourage them to open up and communicate effectively with you rather than kind of shut down within this. And then also think, is this going to be a one-off meeting or are we probably going to have a series of meetings to deal with these issues? And so depending on the type of bad news you're having or the sort of difficult conversation, just thinking about actually, is this probably one of many conversations that I'm going to need to have with this individual? And again, that will just help you to go in with the right frame of mind about what you're trying to achieve within that very specific meeting, because you don't want to try and be over ambitious about resolving every issue or every performance problem within one meeting. That's probably not going to happen. But if you're realistic over it, that's probably going to take a month or 2 months or 3 months or whatever the time frame is. Or there may be some difficult conversations which are just one-offs and you just need, you will know that have it, but then I probably don't need to have that conversation again. So just been thinking about yourself, about your own mental energy, about how much time and effort you need to put into this process. The next thing, again, depending on what type of difficult conversation is, just make sure you've gathered the relevant information and you've got specific facts or figures where you need them about where they've fallen short of a performance issue or whatever. So if it's something, say, around timekeeping, you need to be able to state how many times they've been late and the period by which they've been late or the amount of time that they're not online, and just point that back to what the expectation is of the team. So, we expect you to be online for these 6 core hours, and actually you only logged 4 over the last 3 weeks. So just being very specific with them about how they've not met a metric or how they've not met a performance standard. The more specific you can be, the less room there is for debate or discussion, which is the things that can get emotive and kind of draw you into those difficult conversations. So the more factual and evidential you can be, it's just going to be helpful to kind of direct the conversation in a positive outlook or outcome from it. Also think, do you need any support going into that meeting? So is it a meeting that you feel comfortable doing by yourself? Would you benefit from either someone more senior being in it, or someone from HR, or just a colleague or a peer or another team member? Someone else who's going to be able to give you support if you need it, if you think it's going to get fractious at all. So just thinking about not only you, but also like for the person that they're with. You can ask them if they want to invite someone to the meeting as well, usually for like more formal kind of disciplinary type elements, but it may well be something that they feel comfortable doing. Not everyone's like that. Some people don't want other people to know that they're perhaps are falling short, but it's just another way of just saying, are we both going to be comfortable to have that conversation as constructively as we can? So we talked a little bit about questions, but also just think about how you're going to couch the meeting, how you're going to open it, how you're going to close it. And think about how you want to manage the flow of the meeting. So, what happens if certain things, if you get a bit of silence, what are you going to do? If they get very defensive, how are you going to dissipate that, or how are you going to mitigate it? So thinking about the scenarios that could happen within the meeting, and then having a strategy or a tool or a technique or a question ready that if that does happen, it can allow you to do that. Often the problem is with difficult conversations is because we feel that we just have to react to what's going on. We perhaps don't do it as well as we could. Whereas if we preempt where perhaps some of the trigger points may well be, or some of the really difficult elements of the conversation, we can at least kind of get ahead of it and slightly be proactive in our strategies. And as a manager, you should be controlling and driving that conversation. So making sure you've got that structure, that rhythm, and those tools and techniques when you need to, just to be able to steer that in a positive way. So within that meeting, what you need to be able to do is firstly state what the problem is or what the issue is that you're dealing with, and that you're there to talk about. The next is to take a moment to listen to what they're doing and then question their responses. So teasing out that information from them. Try not to rush through the meeting. There's probably a tendency to get this over as quickly as you can, but actually taking the time to listen, question and explore their responses and make it feel more like a conversation rather than a kind of defense response kind of in court will just help you to kind of establish that positive atmosphere. And to show that you're listening, acknowledge what they're saying and reflect their points back. to them. So you can use phrases such as, oh, I understand what you're saying, or can I clarify what you're saying? Is what you're saying X, Y, and Z? Or is it right to say that you feel this, this, and this happened? So reflect back to them so they, A, can hear it back in a different context, but allows you to show that you're actually genuinely listening to them and are interested in their perspective on this, rather than presenting a load of facts and kind of not really kind of getting into what their perspective is. Once you kind of explored the topic, you need to state or reinforce what your position is. So you might have listened to a lot of reasons or context or background, but you need to kind of reaffirm why you're having this meeting and what your position is. So having listened to all of this, I still feel that we need to work on these areas of improvement. Or thanks for sharing with me your problems on X. That's really helpful to give me context. Let's focus now on what we can do to move the situation forward or improve. So although we need to be empathetic, we also need to hold our ground on where we feel like the actual nub of the issue is, and being able to constructively have that in a conversation is going to make it less difficult for you. So the next stage is to work with them to identify actions or solutions which are going to move this situation forward. So hopefully for the vast majority of difficult conversations, there are ways or things that can be improved that means that this situation gets resolved. Obviously, if it's like a termination or whatever, then it's thinking about what you can do to support them in the next phase. But generally what we want to get is agreement of that action plan. So to get them to buy into the solutions, getting them to identify perhaps what they think are the actions that are necessary. But if you don't think they go far enough or you don't think they're going to be effective, it's okay to push back in that meeting. But don't come with a fully formed action plan about what you think needs to happen, because they're not really going to receive that in the right way. So try and work on that collaboratively together and get their buy-in. They're going to be much more likely to follow it through if they feel that those responses are proportionate and in line with stuff they can do, rather than you just imposing on them what you think needs to happen. So get them to agree the next steps and the actions, and also start to talk to them about timeframes and deliverables and how you're going to know that that's effective. Because sometimes we can have quite vague action plans which don't really allow you as a manager to really effectively monitor it, or indeed the individual to know exactly what's expected of them. So I've got like one situation at work where perhaps someone doesn't know when performance management is likely to be reviewed or ended, and so it's just this kind of ongoing process, and they're not quite sure when they're going to be reviewed again or when there's going to be a clear decision on whether or not we need to take it another way or not. So making sure that you've got some clear timeframes in there so that people know what they're working towards, and knowing the period of time that they have to improve. So once you've been through all the issues and you've got that action plan, the next thing to do is like draw the meeting to a close. And sometimes this can be more difficult than it actually sounds, because you want to be able to make sure that they feel that they've had an opportunity to interject. So I would always ask some, final questions around, is there anything else you want to talk about on this? Have we covered everything you would want to? What have we not touched upon that you thought we would? So try and get some questions for them just to make sure that they don't leave that meeting feeling that they haven't had their say or haven't covered something that they feel is relevant in the wider context. Once you've done that, then close the meeting as supportively as you can, and perhaps if they are distressed or upset, give them options of remaining in the meeting room while you leave so they can collect themselves, or finishing work early, or switching their camera off for the next Teams meeting. Just give them some choices so that they can kind of reflect on what's happened, and not feel like, again, that they've got to go into something else and kind of react differently straight away. After the meeting, I would always follow it up in writing with what we've talked about, what the key outcomes are, and what we're going to do in terms of those action steps, how we're going to monitor it, when we will review it, and then, as I say, if you need to have some follow-up conversations, book those meetings in so they know when they are. But also give them the opportunity to come back to you if there's something else they've thought of, if once they've reflected, there's something they want to change in that action plan. Just give them that potential, unless it's something you fundamentally can't move on, if it's a HR policy or something that you've got no flexibility on. But try and work with them to show that this isn't kind of a one and done process, and then you're open to having an ongoing dialogue about this. The other thing I would do as a manager is reflect myself on that conversation. So I would identify, perhaps not on the day, perhaps a couple of days later, but I would reflect, is there anything I could have done differently? Is there anything I could have done better next time? What's my learning about doing these more difficult conversations? Because it's a bit like anything, the more you do it, actually, the more comfortable you will become, and the more resilience you'll kind of build up in this area. But it's important that you can identify like what you want to do better and how you would kind of move that forward next time, or if you dealt with a similar situation, perhaps some of the different things you might try. So we've talked about why it might be difficult, how to do it and whatever. And I just wanted to kind of close, I say, by why I think this is so important as a manager, because I think a lot of managers aren't very good at these conversations. And I think actually the better you can be at this type of conversation, the better it will be for your team in terms of performance and dealing with poor performance or where standards don't quite meet what you want. But also it's going to be better for you as a leader, because, you know, the higher you go up in organisations, the more it is about having difficult conversations and calling out things and being able to constructively resolve conflict. At most senior organisations, a lot of it is about resolving conflict, or, you know, kind of getting rid of core issues which are affecting teams. So the better you can be at this, the better it will set you up for your own career and make you more effective as you move into leadership roles. And it's also about that resilience point, is that this can be quite draining and quite tough as a manager, and is definitely an area where you can start to second guess yourself, and, you know, kind of it can take its emotional toll on you as a manager. So the better you can get with these conversations and the more effective they become, then that's going to be more rewarding for you as a manager, rather than just having to have negative conversations over and over again because they're not really getting anywhere. So that's going to help you feel more rewarded and less drained by having to do that. So hopefully this video has been helpful for you in terms of like how you can resolve conflict in your teams and how you can have difficult conversations with individuals. I'd love to hear below if you've had to do this and how you found it, or if there's any tips or tricks you've got that will help others to have more effective difficult conversations at work. And as I say, if you have liked this video, then perhaps we can do one about from the other perspective and how you can have a difficult conversation as an employee. But here on my channel, we talk about management and leadership issues and help you just feel more confident at work and navigating your career. So I'm Liz, thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe below, and I'll see you in the next video.